this chapter on agriculture, towards the end, starts talking about the coca leaf and cocaine. You were introduced to the fact that the coca leaf is something traditional in the pre-Columbian Andes, where the people that we refer to as Inca, the people of Tehuantinsuyo, would chew on the coca leaf as a stimulant. And in Mesoamerican times, it was reserved for the elite. Then during colonial times, when the people of Tehuantinsuyo, the indigenous people of the Andes, were put to work on mines. And there, the indigenous people working in the mines would also chew the coca leaf, no longer just the elite, but the workers in the mines would chew it to help with altitude sickness, to curb hunger, and to give them energy. Again, it's a stimulant. The coca leaf is not a narcotic. The coca leaf is a stimulant like caffeine. And then now, in modern times, the coca leaf gets processed into the narcotic we know as cocaine. The coca leaf is not a narcotic. The coca is not cocaine. And, the coca leaf is to cocaine like grapes are to wine or hops are to beer. They are not the same thing. You can today buy the coca leaf in the Andes, any country in the Andes, and make tea out of it. It's very common. It's not illegal. It's very traditional to that part of the world. So the first of all is to know that the coca leaf is not the same as cocaine. Yeah. Next is cacao. Cacao is where we get chocolate from. In English, sometimes we might refer to it as cocoa. And so do not confuse cacao with coca. So don't confuse kind of the origins of cocaine with the origins of chocolate. Two different. The chocolate is a bean like coffee, and coca, cocaine comes from the coca leaf. Here you see the coca leaves being sold. Here, cocaine. And coca is connected to Coca-Cola, where in the early 20th century, or maybe even late 19th, but I think it's early 20th century, where Coca-Cola, the coca comes from the coca leaf, and cola is a nut. And then now we forget kind of the origins. It's all artificial. But that is where it comes from and where it gets that name. And here is the bean of cacao. So it comes from this pod. From this pod, they get the beans out. Here they get the beans, and then you process it into chocolate. All right, so then we get to food in Latin America and how it is regionally different. In the Andes, say Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador, for example, potatoes are prominent. In the Caribbean, yuca, also known as cassava, and plantains are prominent. I remember one time I went to Miami and I went to a Cuban restaurant, And yuca was so prevalent that there was an option to have a yuca appetizer, a yuca side dish, a yuca drink, and a yuca dessert. So it was possible to have yuca in every course of the meal. And plantains are also prevalent. In Central America and Mexico, that's where you find more what gets made with cornmeal, like pupusas, nacatamales, tortillas, and tamales. And I'll show you some examples of what those kinds of foods are if you're not familiar. As I mentioned before, part of it has to do with what crops were grown there. And, that connecting to plantations, kind of what was grown for other parts of the world. And then another part is the degree to which there's indigenous influence, European influence, and African influence. And as you might recall, European influence is strongest in the Southern Cone. African influence is strongest in Brazil and the Caribbean, and indigenous is strongest in Mexico, Central America, and some parts of the Andes. Most Latin American food is not spicy. It's just that for the United States, a lot of our introduction to Latin America is through Mexico. And so then a lot of what we learn about Mexico, we apply to the rest of Latin America. But most Latin American food is not spicy. Here's some examples of the African influence in the Caribbean, specifically in Puerto Rico. They have something they refer to as mofongo. This is mofongo. This thing in this food in the center is made with plantains and then surrounded with shrimp in this example. Again, talking about the African influence in different parts of the Americas, Brazil and the Caribbean having the strongest African influence. A lot of that initially was about sugarcane. And so hence in the Caribbean and Brazil, we have the influence of sugarcane. Part of that has to do with the creation of their own distilled liquor. Rum, for example, is very much associated with the Caribbean. In this case, I think it's a mojito from Cuba. And then for Brazil, their own version of rum is cachaça. And what do they call it? I think it's called a caipirinha, their alcoholic drink, their iconic alcoholic drink, kind of similar to Mexico's margarita. Again, Argentina, the Southern Cone, having the strongest European heritage. So Argentina, the Southern Cone, with the most European influence. And then large countries like Brazil and Mexico have big regional differences. In fact, a lot of other countries, even when they're smaller, especially if they have very different regions, like I'm thinking of Ecuador, or actually a lot of the Andean countries have a lot of differences within them, because they might, like in the case of Colombia, they have a Caribbean coast, they have a Pacific coast, they have Andes, they have jungle, and so these different climates lead to different crops that can be grown and different food that's traditionally eaten there. In the case of Mexico, in northern Mexico, they have more of a US influence. So in the north, they have an influence from the US. They eat more beef. They're more likely to eat flour tortillas. And the food is more similar to what we know as Tex-Mex. So beef and flour are strong US influences in Mexican food. And so here's a flour tortilla. In the center of the country has a more Aztec influence to their diet, to their traditional food. And then in the south of Mexico, they have a stronger Mayan influence. Not to mention, they also have a Caribbean influence. And so, for example, from Veracruz to Quintana Roo, you're more likely to find black beans. Whereas in the center and north of Mexico, you're more likely to find pinto beans, the brown beans. And so, yeah, there's regional differences within countries as well. Mexican food. They're, the margaritas made with tequila. They have their own versions of hot dogs and hamburgers. So in that sense, if anyone ever, talks about kind of Mexican food in the US not being authentically Mexican, Mexico also makes their own version of hot dogs and hamburgers, and they make them different. For example, I don't know if you're not familiar, Mexican hot dogs are very commonly wrapped in bacon, and they're grilled like what do you call it? Like on a skillet, not on a grill and a flame, and wrapped in bacon, and they put a ton of condiments on them. So Mexican food is one of many. Salsas are regularly an option in Mexican food. It is very, like I mentioned, cornmeal products are very common, like tortillas. Yeah, that reminds me of, like these are tacos, but the cornmeal, the flat cornmeal thing that the condiments are put on, the food is put on, is a tortilla, and once you put food on it, it becomes a taco. Yeah. Yeah, and the US and Mexico have strong influences on each other. Here are examples of cornmeal products. These are tortillas right here. And again, there's lots of different types of corn, not just that yellow dent number 2. And from the cornmeal products, again, these have all gone through that nixtamalization process that I mentioned before that augments the vitamins available and the digestibility of corn beyond what corn naturally has. And so, yeah, tortillas, chips, tostadas are like fried tortillas. Chips is when you chop up the tostadas. Sopes are thicker than tortillas, and they have an edge, a border that keeps the food from falling out. Huaraches are sandal shaped, and then tamales are filled. And here's an example of a tamal. And so again, the tortilla gets inflated like that when it's cooking. It starts off like this. And again, these are tortillas, not tacos, and not shells. Shells is when they're deep fried and shaped into this. These are taco shells. Comments, questions, information to repeat or explain?